Welcome to another episode of Squawkulitis! Yeah, I bet you thought this was a one-off just for the Ben 10 video. Okay, let's start with our original source. Markiplier hit it dead on the head when he was talking about his FNaF 1 playthrough. Horror before FNaF was almost always about doing something and having to encounter something scary along the way to a task you were given. The only way to get out of the scary place is to do things, and to do things that means going near the scary. And while this could work to great effect, there was often a problem of you knew when something was coming. You know going into this next room means there's likely going to be next scary thing. FNaF shook things up by making it less about going to a place that was scary and seeing a place that was scary. The camera system makes every single camera a new moment where something awful can happen on camera as the threats in question work their ways towards you. The game is like an onion that slowly peels away at the layers of your understanding of how these characters in this world works. The inherent guttural response of seeing that the bunny's no longer on the stage. Where'd that duck go? Those are the first layer. You know that in the real world, animatronics can't walk off stages. Phone Guy also plays into this first layer by saying stuff like, then there was the bite of 87. That tells you that these things are not only capable of moving, but that they have been restricted from movement for dangerous reasons. Now granted, there is still a layer of plausible deniability in your head. Oh, maybe some kid just got too close to the animatronics. Maybe they didn't mean to hurt someone. And then Bonnie directly stares at the camera. Oh shit. Now, after nights 1 and 2, you're pretty familiar with how Bonnie and Chica work. You also know that that fox thing is staring at you on the camera. Up to this point, your assumption is that everything is just going to be still images of characters on cameras. Now, note that the jump scare in this game is actually really interesting because it directly juxtaposes Bonnie and Chica's behavior. Once again, they are completely still on camera, so them moving in the jump scare is like the freaky payoff. Foxy is then the second layer of subversion. You expect, once again, everything's going to be still until the jump scare. That is what the formula of the game has taught you.
Oh, the sounds, I don't like them. Ah, fuck! No! Oh, yeah! Fucking fuck!
Freddy also plays into the second layer of subversion. Yes, he is still on the camera, but he's not just openly in the shot. He's always like around the corner or in the dark. There's always some way to tell he's there, but it's not as obvious as Chica, until he himself subverts his own trope in that final camera where he is the entire shot. In this second layer alone, we have already completely stripped away your understanding of this fundamental game with just the base mechanics of 2 of the characters. To go back to the camera system a little bit, cameras in video games are a tricky thing. In the 2D era, it was simple. You just show whatever you can show on the screen. In the 3D era, it became complicated, and eventually people figured out the whole flying camera moving around the character. Then there's like the invention of fixed cameras with a lot of your Resident Evil, Silent Hill type games. The reason for the fixed camera is to give a sense of cinematography to it. If you can pick where the camera goes, you can make the best moment. There's a reason not anyone can be a director. Understanding how the camera works is essential to create tension or suspense or feelings or emotions or whatever the hell you want to be in a scene. So having your game literally be about cameras means Scott Cawthon and any creator of a FNaF style game has complete control of how a game is working to convey its horror. This is part of the reason that Observation Duty completely took off. It's effectively playing on the same horror that FNaF is, just with a different gameplay formula. The ability to take what you know and mess with it, as well as the ability to create any shot you want, is an inherent advantage the FNaF series has had since its inception. You can start seeing this to great effect in the third layer. At this point in the game, you are very comfortable with what each and every character does. Bonnie goes in the left hall, Chica goes in the right hall, Freddy goes in the right hall, Foxy runs at you down the left hall. You know what all of their camera renders look like and what they do. What the fuck? Look at this shit! FNaF 1 is one of those games where I feel like the Easter eggs really do change the game, or at least it would not be the same game without them. The posters of kids in the right hall, the Endo looking at you, Golden Freddy being in the game at all, random posters changing where Freddy's ripping apart his own face, the missing kid posters. All of these things take what you understand as the inherent game and start twisting them more and more and more. I really can't understate how Golden Freddy really messes with your understanding of the game. Your perspective is that there's 4 characters in this pizzeria, but then there's this one that doesn't move on any camera. He's just a poster and then he's there. And he doesn't move in his jump scare. He's the complete opposite of every other character. He just completely eclipses your screen and kills you, and this is part of what makes FNaF 1 so scary to a lot of people. The cameras are actually used well here, and the game encourages you to use said mechanics. You have to look at Foxy to know what stage he's in, and that includes looking at his various poses that get kind of more bizarre and kind of creepy. For Freddy, the most efficient strategy is to look at him across his various camera renders as he moves towards you. These two make you look at the scary things, similar to how classic horror games made you go into rooms you didn't want to go to. However, FNaF has this added sense of powerlessness, like you can't do anything as it approaches you. It also makes the gameplay of FNaF very approachable. There's only so many things you can do, and the concept is very straightforward. In FNaF 1, all of the characters are defeated in a very simple process, but your method of approaching them and how you use those resources changes with each character. That is how it made each one unique. FNaF 1 really took advantage of what it was to its full extent. FNaF 2 and 4 royally fucked up in this regard. It's a real shame because FNaF 2 could have really been the proper successor to FNaF 1 if it was handled a little bit better. I think the camera renders in this game are great.
Is what I originally said here before giving some of them a second look. Now, here's something interesting about FNaF 1's camera render stylization. There's this sort of neutral, arbitrary lighting to it. Like, it doesn't physically make sense why it would be lit this way always, but it's lit in the best way to make them look atmospheric and scary, you know? They're still very shadowy while just barely visible enough where you can make out what's supposed to scare you. FNaF 2's weird lights on, lights off camera gimmick sometimes gets in the way of what could be really good camera renders. I feel like if the lights on off gimmick wasn't in this game and it was more of a neutral lighting between these two, a lot of these renders could look even better than they do already. Some of the renders have the potential to be nice and ominous, but they don't really go all out the way some of the FNaF 1 renders kind of do. And honestly, while a lot of people talk about the toys aging poorly, or more accurately, the toys and Glamrock's not being scary enough for the games they're in, I feel that's kind of missing out on half the story here. With Toy Bonnie, I do think he is probably the most disappointing design of the toys in terms of how he's used in-game. His main problem is that the game never does anything to make him scary. He kind of stays his normal self throughout the entire game. He's not quite bug-eyed enough to really play into that ugly angle, and once again, he doesn't have anything like the others where it's like the eyes go dark, he's missing a chunk of his face, which is a shame because some of his renders, like Something Borrowed Something New, really showed that he can really look interesting visually. The game just doesn't really let him ever do that in any of his renders. I can't even really fix it by modifying the lighting. But other than that, just saying the toys aren't scary, I think doesn't do what this game is, or the discussion that really should be had, justice. Unlike FNaF 1, you don't get to revel in and look at these renders as much because who wants to stare at an unchanging box for all nights after night 2? The puppet is like taking FNaF 1 Foxy, but you're only allowed to look at the first phase and the very last phase. And unlike FNaF 1 Foxy, you aren't encouraged to look at anything else. This is your only reason to use the camera. Let me get this straight, the fear of the unknown is great and all, and it's a nice concept in a game. The problem is, there's so much other shit in this game that we don't get to look at because of the fear of the unknown. Since 10 out of our 11 threats are in the known and not in the unknown in terms of their horror, restricting the known horror about them is the game shooting itself in the foot. In exchange for making the puppet ominous and mysterious, we have made every other character a lesser side point in this overall problem. We don't get to see them be scary. We don't get to build up their ominous threats as the various lighting across the camera. We don't get to learn their movement patterns or personalities. We don't get to see things change on the cameras and be subverted. We get to look at this one goddamn corner of the room. Wither Foxy has the same problem. Your only experiences with him are him in this one pose and this one camera image you can't even see normally. Because, you know, which is a shame because the parts and service renders are really good. Hell, a lot of the Withers renders are really good. But once again, you don't get to look at them nearly as much as you should. Oh, and The Office. Don't even get me started on The Office. So, on paper, the idea of a room with 3 entrances and no doors is a great subversion of FNaF 1's gameplay. The problem is, how the game handles this takes away of so much horror it should have. The idea of these characters moving into this room that you can't stop should be the natural progression of the first game. But the office is so brightly lit. Instead of having atmospheric moments or having the lighting completely taken advantage of, it's just bear.png staring at you.
Now granted, they're not that bad, they're on paper solid poses, but seriously, these could be so much better looking if they were taken advantage of a little bit more.
Not to mention, and this is a problem with FNaF 3 as well, the strange cylindrical filter that Scott used in the Click Team engine that's supposed to create like 3D depth doesn't really work in this office. Like, I'd honestly rather it just pan left and right in this one. I don't know, it looks a lot more polished when you're looking at the actual flat renders than it does in-game, weirdly enough. This is what the image should look like, and this is what it looks like in-game. Not to mention, the whole panning of the room isn't taken advantage of really in this. The only difference from being one side or the other is you have to pan one way to look at one side or pan the other. Having 2 doors in the first game was a constant juggling of 2 resources you had. Obviously, closing 2 doors meant you were using twice as much power. That meant having 2 different sides of threats actually mattered to the player. The only threat here is that I have to go from one side to the other. And when Toy Chica and Mangle just leave anyway, along with BB, the only side you really need to check is Toy Bonnie, unless no one appeared in the office, in which case you actually do have to check the vent. Another weird anomaly with the office going on is the fact that when the characters show up in the office, there's this whole like blink away effect the game has. But the weird thing is, the room doesn't really change lighting, it's more like a black PNG just being flashed on the screen. Like, the room doesn't actually get darker. To put in perspective how much this can change, here is just me messing with the brightness filter, and here's what it actually looks like in-game. Like, I'm not even actually messing with the assets or the lighting in real time. This is literally just me putting a slider up and down, and in my opinion, it looks more like the actual lights are flickering in and out, which I think is what's supposed to be happening here, than the actual game does. Not to mention, once again, the panning doesn't do anything, so you're just kind of staring at them. Wouldn't it be more interesting if the characters were on one side or the other of the room and you had to like follow them or look at them to make sure they went away? If we're going to be stuck staring at them the whole time, which is how the game works, you're just stuck with the mask on when you stop them correctly, why not make a little bit of gameplay out of that? Just make it so you have to like look at them, some mechanic? I mean, that would help make them all feel even just a little bit more unique, you know? Because they all just kind of stand there at the end of the day. This is like it. This is all you get to see the characters in most of the time. Because you're not allowed to look at the characters in any other context, this is all you ever see. Maybe you'll see them a little bit in earlier nights when there's still time to look at cameras that aren't the music box corner. And same thing with Foxy, you get to look at him in this one shot down the hall. Granted, you get to see a few other characters down the hall this way, and that's a fine moment. But seriously, with this gameplay loop, the only reason you see as many renders as you do is because there's so many goddamn characters. Which I don't think would be nearly as much of a problem if it didn't lead to such constant repetition throughout the game. If pulling down the mask immediately as you flip down the camera every time is the only real point of the game, other than the 2 main mechanics that actually really matter, it's just one gameplay loop forever. Functionally in this game, 3 characters are the exact same to us the player. 2 characters are effectively the same because losing to BB is effectively the same as just dying outright. Mangle's a little unique because of the audio gimmick, but is effectively the same as the others. It goes away anyways. That makes the only completely unique characters Toy Bonnie because he actually has weird startup gimmicks to how he gets into your room. Puppet, obviously, Gold Freddy, and Withered Foxy. At its best, when the FNaF formula really works, it's all about the choice of it all. If I close the door now, I know I'll be safe before they attack, but the longer I close the door, the more power I use up, which means I might enter my lose state sooner. Am I gambling on them being more aggressive or less aggressive? A skilled player can use the doors as little as possible. Something I really liked about Help Wanted 2's recreation of the custom night / sister location minigames is it really wanted you to cut the corner as close as possible unlocking the doors. That's one of the cool things about FNaF is if you really play into that angle, it can become genuinely nail-biting to cut it as close as possible to save as much power as possible. In FNaF 2, there's a limit to how much skill can really give you. At a certain point, it's not about what the game teaches you or the inherent choices of using resources, it's using exploits and glitches in the mechanics of the game to eliminate the wizards moving, or using a timer to perfectly stop the characters when they approach you. FNaF 2's gameplay loop tries to give the choice, but it functionally doesn't at a certain rate. Because of how the mask works, you just have to do it. It's a choice you're forced to always make. Your only choice in the game is, how much do I flash Foxy and how much do I wind the music box? And a lot of times it doesn't even matter at a certain level. It either works or it doesn't. Sometimes the game just screws you over. FNaF 1 and 3 are a lot like a trading card game where it's like, oh, I have to draw and get lucky still. There's still some amount of luck, but a lot of it's my decisions with what I have. Two different runs of the same RNG in FNaF 1 could look different depending on how the players handled them. FNaF 2 runs might change a little bit based on how a different player weights Foxy versus the puppet, but at its core, the gameplay loop is going to look identical. FNaF 2 is like blackjack. There is some level of choice, but it's a lot of luck. A lot more luck than most of the FNaF games, which is saying something. Even Sister Location Custom Night made its characters more unique and interesting per character. It has the same number of characters, it has one less character, and almost all of them do something a little different from each other. When the gameplay and characters of FNaF 2 feel samey and repetitive, it's a fault of its design in this context, not the inherent format of having 10 characters. Now, while you could argue it would have been a better game if Scott had more time, and I do agree to an extent, this inherent gameplay loop, as it was made in FNaF 2, can only be so much better. Without making changes, like I said, with the characters moving around or having Foxy on one camera you have to look around for or something like that, without making noticeable changes to how the loop works, this is kind of all it can really be to an extent. And once again, going to development time, to put this in perspective, now granted Sister Location was already complete so he could reuse a lot of models and assets from that, Sister Location Custom Night was made in a briefer window than FNaF 2 was. Accounting for the modeling time, there's probably a very similar development period for these two experiences. And Sister Location Custom Night has more depth than FNaF 2 does. Not by an ecstatic margin, but each character still has more interesting stuff going on. Funtime Freddy and Ballora both play with audio, but in very different ways. Funtime Freddy is all about listening to what he says and what side, whereas Ballora is just as simple as listening to which side her music is. Electrobab and Mini Rain are both annoying in that they play on power, so they're repetitive there, but Funtime Foxy has a completely unique mechanic, the other Mini Rainas have a unique mechanic, Bonnet has a unique mechanic, Yendo has a unique mechanic. So once again, you can make 10 characters unique within a very narrow window of time. FNaF 2 just doesn't encourage you to look at the scary thing. And this would have been shockingly easy to fit. Just make Withered Foxy move from camera to camera and you have to flash him wherever he is. Now you have him with all these creepy renders in all these different locations. Now you have a reason to look around, and hey, while you're looking around at him, you'll see the other characters inevitably. Hell, have the puppet itself move around the map and have it so you can barely see it or can't even see it other than something like a music cue, like the music box audio playing. And then have Phone Guy say something like, oh, it doesn't like the light. Now your weird-ass flashing the light on camera mechanic actually does something. It stops Foxy but aggravates the puppet. Now you have to go back to the music box counter to wind the music box to make sure you don't piss off the puppet too much. Now you can wind the music box and when it's ticking down, it will soothe it. It can be empty, but the puppet won't kill you until you flash. And then if you flash, it'll be pissed off, then you go to the music box, rewind it. It's effectively a similar concept in practice and keeps the puppet just as mysterious, but makes it more interesting. Now, blinking around the cameras, looking at all these different places is a frantic, oh god, what do I do, panic moment. You know how I made a big deal about FNaF 1 subverting your expectations? FNaF 2 doesn't get to do that. You don't get to look at weird, rare things because you only get to look at the puppet. That means the only anomalies are the ones that appear in your office, and even then, you're so frantically moving around you never get to notice them. FNaF 3, I think, is much better about this stuff overall. While maybe not as good as FNaF 1, there's always some new Happiest Day minigame, and there's always the Between Night mini, so you always have something new to look forward to, even if the base game never changed. Then you have the fact that Night 2 introduces Springtrap, and Nights 3, 4, and 5 add more and more appearances to the Phantoms. I honestly feel like the Phantoms are alright, they just could have been handled better. I feel like the only problem with the Phantoms is that they attack you so fast in later nights, it's hard to understand what was happening or see their cooler, superior camera renders often. Seriously, a lot of their jump scares are just worse than their actual appearances. I feel like FNaF 3 is really at its best with the Tango of Trap. I would say Springtrap is either the best or one of the best antagonists in FNaF, and I don't think that's a really controversial opinion. He's mysterious and ominous in the first half of the game, his design is S tier, his lore ends up being great and really cathartic for people who cared about these kids and spirits. There's so many renders with it, in fact one camera can have multiple renders, and there's this interesting mix of like, The main problem was with The Office, because it's FNaF 2 but green. It's still way too lightly Brit, it's still really big, which means you don't get the claustrophobic feel of FNaF 1, and Springtrap is just so goddamn neutral in it. He stands at you and stares at you, that's an alright moment. He stands at you and stares at you around the corner, alright, that's an alright moment. Oh, he pulls her way around the corner. Okay, that's an alright moment. That's it. Wouldn't it be great if instead of this brightly lit office, you could just barely see things with the light of Freddy in the corner? What if you had to scare him away with a flashlight and that was your only line of defense whenever he got through your cameras? Now you have to look through him in the dark. Now, obviously you can argue FNAF 3 has the gameplay loop problem like FNAF 2, where it forces you to have Springtrap go between the same few spots on the cameras over and over, hence tedium, right? Kinda, but not really. While the strategy does work really well on early nights, towards the later half of the game that becomes less and less effective. It's more of like a desirable, like, hey, if it happens thing. And you know how I mentioned that FNAF games are good when they make you make decisions of like, oh, I do this and it risks this, but it might be better for this? The repair system and your limited amount of audio lures means you have to make choices like, oh, I can lure him a bunch of times in a row right now, and then be at the mercy of whatever he does, or if I think he's in a good spot now, I can make a break for it to try and fix the audio lure to get a few more shots in. Not to mention the different places on the cameras have different phantoms on them, which means there's inherent decision making of like, hey, if I know he's in this camera, I can avoid the problem entirely by luring him to the camera next to it. I can avoid the phantoms outright. Not to mention the fact that he can be on multiple cameras means you're actually looking for him rather than looking at one static pose for the whole game. And the different camera layers means there's a lot of interaction with said camera. Could there be a little bit more variety in lighting? Yes. Could there be a little less grain? Yeah, kinda. It's actually not as grainy when you're actually playing it as it looks when you're watching it back on YouTube. But yes, I would appreciate if it was a little bit more crystal clear, because these renders just look that good that you sometimes are missing detail that's really there. FNAF 1 and 2 also had a bit of this, but this is probably the most extreme example of noise grain, making it hard to see what's going on, even if I think it's a little overblown in how the community talks about it. Now granted, we all know that Springtrap's jump scare sucks. I will say it does something better than FNAF 2 and 1's jump scares, in that almost all of the jump scares in FNAF 3 has some level of diegeticness to them. What I mean by that is they're tangible, real events seeming. Even the phantoms, which I know sounds contradictory, but what I mean is they aren't just in the void screaming at you and biting you or whatever. With FNAF 2, there's a lot of moments where it's like, where am I being attacked from? Where is Withered Bonnie appearing from when he jump scares me? Where is Toy Bonnie jumping from? He's just behind the desk in front of me. Is Foxy physically leaping all the way from the back of the hallway right at me? The weird ass perspective of the game doesn't really make that make sense or immersive. Whereas all of the phantoms feel like they're physically in the space moving towards you. Well, other than Withered Freddy. He just kind of does the FNAF 2 thing of popping from the bottom of the screen upward. But both the Springtrap's jump scares feel like he's physically in the room then moving at you. If the actual jump scare animation itself was a little bit better, it would feel a lot more immersive than a lot of the prior games where they were just kind of there. Now granted, that's also a praise I have for FNAF 4. All of the jump scares in the game really play with the perspective as the characters lift you up, which also is alluding to the game's ending with the bullies. It has narrative weight while also having a dynamic, really interesting jump scare as the characters really play with the weight of the room. The praise of FNAF 4 is concluded. Well, not really, I have other things I like about FNAF 4. But primarily what I mean is, we have so many of the same goddamn problems as FNAF 2 here. Now I will say we aren't struggling with the lighting of the room this time around, that's nice. And oh boy, does FNAF 2's problem of not having enough unique renders we're actually looking at just really in full effect here. In fact, it's even worse because FNAF 2 at least had those renders somewhere, you just had to look for them. FNAF 4 really does cap out at what it has for you to look at. You have the hallway animations where the characters slunk back in the darkness where you can just barely look at them, and then you have their jump scares. That's it. That is all you experience of most of the characters in this game. Honestly, Foxy's really shows how the other two could have been way better. I find staring at the ugly, weird fox thing in the closet that changes poses much more interesting visually than the nightmares are in the other hallways. Freddy is kind of better and worse because he only has his jump scare really, but the Freddles are there, so it kind of is a little bit better because there's like, oh, that's kind of freaky movement, but that's all they really do. It's just lame, man, because like, it's a fine moment the first time or two, but that's all they do. It's that, then they're at your door attacking you. You don't even see them when they're attacking you, which is like, that's a kind of creepy moment also, but we're missing like a middle step here. Wouldn't it be cool if we could see them like midway down the hallway? Like we know Scott could do that. That happens with Nightmare and Nightmare Fredbear. It's a great moment, one of the best moments with these two. Why aren't there like second and third stages before the final stage of them being at the door? Hell, give them a variety of animations where they can be in various poses down the hall. The game hardcore focuses on the whole nightmare scary teeth angle, but they're honestly freakier as weird, almost mannequin-like ugly dolls. Plushtrap demonstrates this pretty well. Like I said, they're bug-eyed, they look uncanny in a different way than a lot of the other characters, but the game only makes them slasher monsters. FNAF's horror wasn't just scary boo, slashy slashy stab like Jason Voorhees. It's at its best with the kind of weeping angel, like uncanny horror angle. And the nightmares don't play into that at all. They only focus on the movement angle of them, which once again would be fine if it was part of a bigger overall package, but it isn't. Half the characters in the game only exist in 3 states to the player. Not there at all, barely a threat, and about to kill you. Hell, have weird shit happen in the hallways, have Bonnie and Chica twitch like they did in FNAF 1 since it was kind of a celebration of that game in terms of its formula. Do horror moments, you know? Make it so sometimes when you turn around, Freddy's hands are reaching out from under the bed and slunk away into the dark. Have Foxy's hand like retract into the dark from the closet sometime. One of the cooler moments in the game is when you see the door move as Foxy enters it. Wouldn't it be cool if sometimes you could get a little bit of a peek at him from the closet? Do the FNAF 1 thing where things in the hallways randomly change. We're already doing that in some points, like with the IV drip and flowers, so why not have weird shit happen in the hallway? Have the hallways be like extremely torn up. FNAF 4 has so many easy opportunities to make horror, and it just does the safe, boring things of approach and scream at you. And also, just a reminder that FNAF 3 had more content than this, really. Not only does Springtrap have way more renders to the point where I would say that they make up for the fact that they're not as animated, but he also did have animation, and they have 6 bonus minigames to look for, on top of the Between Night minigames that FNAF 3 also has. Now granted, I'm not going to pretend that Nightmare and Nightmare Fredbear aren't great subversions of this formula, but what's strange about it all is that these show that the game entirely could have been like this. What I'm saying is not weird fantasy that couldn't have happened feasibly. Scott has demonstrated he can do animation in Click Team for this game. And hell, I'm not even saying that there should be constant animation in the halls or like a billion renters. Just give me like 4 different things to look at in each hall, please. Give me scary moments in this horror game. You have proved you can do this with 4 of the characters, but you only do so in situational moments. The ability to see a character midway down the hall is a boss fight gimmick in this game. The ability to see characters in uncanny, weird positions is tied to one character who only appears between nights and isn't even part of the main gameplay loop. One character in your room. The little gremlin creatures of a bigger threat in your room, as well as the main boss plus his reskin, which you can play almost without looking at if it weren't for the closet and the bed renders. Not to mention, can I just vent a bit about how much the breathing mechanic sucks? It's like the cheapest way to get a jump scare. It's like having your friend be like, oh, I put your prized possession on this top shelf. Then you gotta stretch on your tippy toes to try and reach it on this really high shelf, and then they gut punch you every time you stretch out to try and reach it. But you can only go for it by reaching up that far. So either you just have to dodge it every time, or you just take the punch, and you have to keep doing it until you eventually get the goddamn box. That's what FNAF 4's goddamn gameplay loop is. It forces you to listen and then makes the punishment for not listening being blasted in the ass. What's even worse is the breathing doesn't even always work. There's like a dip in the audio where there's no sound playing. That means even if you're paying attention, if you don't just wait long enough, you just will get punished anyway. There's no trade-off here like FNAF 1's gameplay had. In FNAF 1, your trade-off for safety was that you're going to be more dangerous later. By using the doors inappropriately, you won't have power to protect yourself later down the road. 4 just fucks you over. The game never tells you that if you close the door too early, the characters will typically approach you and then punish you by killing you. But this causes a lot of weird anomalies in gameplay. Combined with the fact that there's a rare chance, or at least it doesn't happen that often, or maybe it does, maybe that's some of the anomalies I've experienced that have killed me randomly, but sometimes they can be at your door, then walk away without you closing it. And I did not even know that was a thing until I was recording footage with the map displayed so I could demonstrate where the AI went, and saw this happen. Out of reflex, I closed the door despite having the map open, causing Chica to be stuck at my side because once again, if you close the door while they're at the middle point of the hall, and you close the door, they rush you. And as far as I understand, they never leave once they do that. Once again, they can go to your door, then back off to this middle point, which means even if you were paying attention and counting, you might think, oh, maybe I counted wrong because I just heard a movement sound effect. That must mean they're now at my door. I should close it 100%, right? Not to mention, the game never tells you have to flash the light down the hall to make sure they're just clear, because otherwise if you don't flash the light after you've got rid of stuff, or if you just don't flash the lights in the halls enough in general, The cupcake kills you, not to mention when you're running to one side and a character moves to that side mid-run. While stuff like this was theoretically possible during FNaF 1, where like you could have the light on and then they could appear towards the end of the light flash, or just in the time after you check the light, it's always been a lot less common of an experience. But the duration of the animation for going back and forth around the FNaF 4 room means there's like this delayed feedback whenever I'm trying to do something. On paper, this could have made the game really challenging as you're always on this last stretch to try and get from one side to the other. But it doesn't really feel like that to me, especially since you always have to go back to the center of the room to do anything. You can't go from one side to the other like you could do in the Help Wanted remakes of the minigames. Makes it less likely you're actually running around a room to try and stop all the threats, but more like you're just playing FNaF 1, but there's a delay from going one side to the other. This is once again something where I feel like a middle stage would have helped here. If there was literally any visual indication, it could help ground you a little bit knowing where you are in the world. I understand that's supposed to make tension and that's supposed to make fear, but more often than not, it just pisses me off. This is really testing the bullshitometer. As I mentioned before, there's a delicate line between a fair challenge for the sake of the video game you're playing and a random chaotic scenario where you don't have control. Being powerless is supposed to be in the game, I understand that. However, there's a certain point where it becomes so predictably powerless that it just frustrates me. If I realized I fucked up because I don't hear the sound effect of Chica moving away, I'm not going to be scared by flashing the light at her and being surprised that she's there. I just have to sit here and wait to die or press escape and exit the game. The first few times that might inspire dread or fear, but every time after that, it just is annoying. When this is most of the game, this is a problem with the game. And let me make this clear, because I know the internet really likes to twist words and really likes the, so you're saying it should be this when I say something or anyone says anything really at all. I'm not saying we should have just had FNaF 3.2 or FNaF 1.4. I really respect the idea of going a new direction with the gameplay and really trying something different. The problem is, much like FNaF 2, you can really feel how this game is rushed. There's this extra little bit I feel like it could have gone to really make the mechanics feel like they really work really tight. And sometimes I can see the brimming light of a better game underneath it all. But there are so many times where it feels like the control is ripped away from me just to kill me, yet when you start ripping away control constantly, it makes it very clear that you're going to lose control, and makes the loss of control meaningless. There are still moments when playing FNaF 1 and 3 where something goes just a little bizarre or off what I expect, and I can feel that sense of powerlessness that I don't normally feel in the game. In a weird way, because 1 and 3 are so lenient, when they don't hold back, when they do sucker punch you out of nowhere, it makes the punch hit harder. FNaF 2 and 4 are so goddamn brutal at times that it stops being a sucker punch you didn't expect and starts being a haymaker that's happening over and over again. It stops scaring you, it just starts hurting. It's very clear to me FNaF 4 was completely reactionary to 3. Jump scare doesn't hit hard enough. Gameplay loop isn't intense enough. Make it harder, have more shit going on. Animatronics are constantly real threats. And this is kind of a pattern with a lot of FNaF games. 4's story made the least sense, so Sister Location was almost all story. FNaF 2 was too chaotic, so 3 calmed down and focused more on one threat. 3 was too calm, so it went back to chaos for FNaF 4. People weren't satisfied with the night sections of 6, so Ultimate Custom Night is the ultimate night section. Hell, even FNaF 1 is reactive to Chipper and Son. The problem is, I feel like, in many ways, in Scott's haste to make a true, proper finale to the series, he took a lot of the wrong lessons from 3 and applied them to 4, and, in his own words, like he did with FNaF World, rushed the game expecting people to like it because it was FNaF, and not understanding the consequences and true magic of the community he kind of had. Once again, those are his words for what happened with FNaF World, and I think this does apply to a solid extent to 4. And oh boy, can you feel that in its nonsensical story. And I do want to emphasize that it's nonsensical. Most of the FNaF games up to 1, 2, 3, and honestly after this, feel like they have some reason to exist in universe. Like, even if you're not paying attention to the lore, and even if you don't actually understand accurately what's going on, or there's like twists and subversions of what you think is happening, you can still kind of vibe between game to game. Okay, this is Haunted Chuck E. Cheese Pizzeria. Okay, this is slightly like sleeker, redesigned Haunted Pizzeria. Okay, this is one built on the tragedy of Haunted Pizzeria. Okay, this is like a high-tech bunker spin-off of Haunted Pizzeria. Okay, this is a VR recreation of all the Haunted Pizzerias, and that's including some of the haunting that's following it. Okay, I'm a kid trapped in this high-tech mall pizzeria. Okay, I'm an employee working at pizzeria. What the fuck is FNaF 4? Why are we in a house? Why are there horrific nightmare versions? Are these literal real animatronics? Why would they exist? Are we this kid between nights? Are we his older brother? Who the hell are we? Like, who the fuck playing through the FNaF games is ever going to get the context of Dittophobia? Closest thing to context elsewhere is the cameo in Sister Location, which is a secret minigame unlockable where you have to go right after completing the secret death minigame and put in a code 1983, which was a secret Easter egg in FNaF 4. FNaF 4 doesn't make sense to the common player. There isn't that inherent level of immersion of like, oh, I'm trapped working at this pizzeria because it's my job. I'm just being tormented by a bunch of fucking nightmare bots for the sake of being tormented by a bunch of nightmare bots. I mean, like, what's special about this kid suffering from the other ones? That he was bullied more? I know we shouldn't be comparing suffering of victims, but who's this kid? What does he have to do with anything? Why do we care about him? I don't know, he just suffers, and that's all we have to work with him. When your only trait is crying, and all you do is cry in the entire game, it doesn't feel like there's any change to progression or any reason to like him. The only reason we want the bite victim to not suffer is out of general empathy. Like, oh man, it sucks, I hate that your brother's bullying you. I'd argue that FNaF 3 conjured more complicated and interesting emotions with its backgrounds and its choice of music. Hell, the fact that we have these souls attached to characters means we have personalities we can kind of imprint on them by proxy. The idea of being trapped in those suits for so long and being killed by someone you can't even understand that took advantage of you is freaky. Hell, we didn't even have dialogue other than Phone Guy and the little bits of prompts in the FNaF 2 minigames before FNaF 4. Yet despite all his screen time, it still feels like he's underdeveloped. And I do want to make that clear. I'm not saying he should suffer more or that he's not suffering the right way. I'm saying that if he's going to suffer and we're going to make that a huge focus of the narrative, I want to know who the kid suffering is. What's his role in this larger story? Why should I feel bad for him suffering? Like I said, there's inherent empathy. That can go a solid way to conveying why this character exists in this space and why we should feel bad. But it stops being a story when there's no character involved. And you don't need tons and tons of dialogue to do that. There's one brief moment in the game that feels like it's almost trying to convey a bit of his character. These are my friends. Well, that shows he's not great at making friends with other kids, because otherwise, why would he make a big deal about these being his friends? And it also means he's really attached to the characters, even if he's afraid of the overall characters at the pizzeria. That's kind of interesting. I wish there was more stuff like this. Just give him like a few more other interactions throughout the game. Almost every other kid gets very quickly defined personalities, even if they're very surface level. The only thing I can really run off of with the bite victim is that I guess he's shy? It overall means that something that could have hit really, really hard, especially with the ending on night 6, only hits alright, kind of hard, serviceable enough. Yet for this being the finale of a series so known for its lore, it feels like in many ways with 4, it ditched all of that for a story that it just didn't let live up to its full potential. It really is a shame because FNaF 4 could have shown how it could have had better quality to make up for its lack of quantity. For a non-3D engine, it really does feel like a 3D game moving through 3D spaces. The character designs are really detailed. The problem is there's only so much to how they're applied. This is why quantity matters in this context. When there's only one thing, like imagine if a Mario game was one level, that's not interesting, there's not depth there. No matter how good that one level is, if it's the normal length of one Mario level and that's all there is, that's all there is. Yeah, we have one good slunking away animation and one good jump scare per each character other than Nightmare, Fredbear, and Foxy. But when that's effectively the summary of their role in this game, I would like more, you know? I drastically prefer Springtrap's large variety of renders, even if they aren't as technically impressive as FNaF 4's. Hell, in some ways they're just as impressive with Springtrap because they have real-time lighting in some instances. I drastically take Sister Location's character designs and drastically more unique scenarios than anything FNaF 4 offers. FNaF 4 is playing it safe by just sticking sharp teeth on characters and then just screaming at you. Grr, ah, scary monster. Look at the modular face shit. That's so much more interesting to look at for a jump scare than anything FNaF 4 ever tried to do. A crazy bear laughing in the dark as you struggle to look around for him. A twitching moving fox that blinks away between flashes of a light. A big ballerina dancing right in front of you as the sound passes right by you. These are all more interesting dynamic moments that Sister Location alone offered. And unlike FNaF 4, it feels like this is actually happening to an extent, you know? Like, it has a lot of the FNAFisms, but it feels like we're actually moving around a building and these things are around there with us. You know how I said that FNaF 2 and to a lesser extent FNaF 4 have a struggle with making choices and weighting one option versus the other? because they're just kind of a correct way to play the game or a correct approach. Sister Location's main formula is constantly giving you a new thing to think about and a new objective to work towards at the risk of you getting hurt along the way. In a way, it's basically a FNAFification of that classic gameplay loop that I mentioned earlier that a lot of horror games before FNAF really focused on. Now your ability to escape the danger scenario is juggling a resource. It's a very simple concept, but each character iterates on it a little bit more. So while there isn't truly one coherent set of gameplay, it is still iterating on itself and still running on a lot of the same logic and rationale throughout the game. Not to mention, it has an entire extra FNAF game tacked onto it. FNAF 4's free add-on was just a new skin for each character, basically. While you can argue Sister Location is just a bunch of minigames, I find each of those minigames more unique than what FNAF 4 offered, with more unique antagonists than what FNAF 4 offered. And also, unlike FNAF 4, it felt like the story was actually doing something. You might not like what it was doing, but it's trying. FNAF's Sister Locations Between the Night build-up actually is build-up. We know from the very first cutscene in the game that Baby is dangerous, or at least that there's something off about her. And then throughout the game you interact with her, learning more and more about her personality and that something happened to a girl she interacted with. Now we hear this girl between nights that we're wondering about, like, oh shit, is that her? And then it pays off and actually happens, and we hear it, and then we see it in this minigame. And then it freaks you out in that last moment. We actually get to hear Elizabeth's voice and personality. Once again, you can argue you don't like the additions to the story, and you don't like the more sciencey Afton. I don't think of him as a mad scientist though. But I'd argue it's doing more than FNAF 4 ever tried to do, and makes for an overall more interesting and memorable experience than a lot of FNAF 4. And if we're talking gameplay in my FNAF game, I think the best feeling FNAF thing in terms of a challenge that's given to you is the Ennard boss fight. While Fredbear and Nightmare are good bosses for FNAF 4 in terms of the loop it made as a game, Ennard is probably my favorite boss fight of a FNAF game, period. The timing is tight, the risk reward is great, because you can just cut it so close, but then sometimes Ennard's quick enough with that little bit of bullshit you need in a video game to make it so you're punished for not being safe. The removal of lights in this context is great because you can check the cameras, which takes extra power to be certain to where Ennard is, but also you still have to scramble around to find Ennard, which takes time, which means you're using more power, which rewards you to be quicker on the cameras while also using them as little as possible. In this context, getting that extra bit of information is still challenging and punishing to a player, but isn't the instant severe punishment of flashing the light at the wrong time in FNAF 4. The use of the cameras combined with the doors in this feels just good, tense. What it's supposed to be in a fucking horror game. The game is constantly asking you to consider the weight of the doors and the power you have. It's that close and precise that it really matters how close you cut it with the door. Because Ennard can kill you that quickly, now you're freaking the fuck out because Ennard can attack you at any moment. Ennard also has a variety of sound effects. While they don't all mean different things, it's just nice to have something different going on throughout the night. And it's also nice that the cameras are there to supplement the sound effects, not just completely have one or the other in the system. The sound effects are a little less reliable because, like FNAF 4, Ennard can move away or towards your door without attacking, but you can spend that power to learn exactly where Ennard is. If a FNAF game is ever made after this that conveys that level of oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit that I frequently get while playing the Ennard boss fight, then I think that will probably be the FNAF game with the best gameplay. That is what I'm talking about when I say there's a line between bullshit and fair, that a good horror experience can really walk in this regard. FNAF 1 is just a little too lenient to always get that, and FNAF 3 is definitely on the too easy side for it most of the time. But the Ennard boss fight is still really fucking hard, to the point where when I was trying to get footage of it for this video, I spent over 40 minutes and did not beat it. Yet at the same time, I wanted to replay because I knew I was so close and I could almost do it. I never have had that with FNAF 4. Whenever I play FNAF 4, it feels like I'm being punished and forced to play more FNAF 4. Now you might think from what I've said from the rest of the video, I do not like FNAF 6. It's complicated. The salvage minigames are some of the best horror experiences the FNAF series has to offer, especially on the first few playthroughs. These renders are so well lit and so atmospheric, and the situation you're in is very simple, very easy to understand, but it has a lot of subtle little nuance to how the characters move, and like the little quirks of like watching them like, oh, it's just slightly different. I need to shock you now, but like if I shock you too many times, I'll lose money later, and I won't be able to use that money to like speed up the defending myself in the office sections. And this office gameplay, while far from the best that FNaF has to offer gameplay-wise. At least does have some of the risk-reward of, like, the more information you gather, the less time you're spending on progressing the night, which means you get out of there slower. However, knowing more about your threats means you're better prepared against them. Though that said, I feel like it would have been much better if we just added in cameras as a final mechanic, maybe replace the motion detection system with cameras instead. I know that may have caused the game to come out even later than it already did compared to Sister Location, but I think that could have really added to some of the character design. I feel like the only benefit to not having cameras is the extra shock value the first time a character kills you, which in this game is not a given right away. You don't understand how the threats are approaching your building in this one quite the same way you do the other games. So there's this great payoff in the first few nights of the characters killing you being like, oh shit, that thing I bought that was heavily discounted maybe brought that thing in, or I let this thing in when I salvaged it. That moment where the game's salvage mechanics click and it just makes sense to you is really great, but I think it could have still worked with cameras. Maybe not a ton of cameras, maybe something closer to the map size of Sister Location where you only have like a few to look at. And I think that to an extent, potentially, a variation on the door system could have worked really well. Something like you have to hold something shut, kind of like FNaF 4, but it's like right there so you don't have to run to a location. That might have worked really interestingly and made it much more clear what you were doing to stop the antagonists. In 6's actual gameplay, it doesn't feel like you're stopping them, because why would a light stop the animatronics who have been through the ringer several times over? I feel like having to hold a door shut manually is something that kind of makes sense for stopping these deadly animatronics without just repeating the old door formula over and over again. It also does call back to FNaF 4, and in this context makes sense for the cramped claustrophobic feel of the game. One thing that really bit this game in the ass, though, was its jump scares. God, they are like the least diegetic jump scares of any FNaF game for the main night jump scares. FNaF Sister Location also had this a little bit where the characters kind of blink in, and I didn't like that there. But this is like even less logical because there's only 4 characters and you only have 2 routes for them to come from, so you only have to design 2 jump scares. You don't have to design 50 jump scares in this game. Why the time couldn't have been taken just to have the FNaF 3 mechanic where like it forces you to pan the direction they're coming and they just scream and crawl out of the vent or something. That would have been more visually interesting than, hi, we pop into the frame. God, it's the reason Afton looks so dumb in this game. I know his design isn't great overall, but as shown in the salvage minigames, with proper lighting, he actually does look kinda cool. But he just fucking pops into frame with his silly goddamn cartoony eyes and huge forehead, and you can't take him seriously. And once again, diegetic jump scares are shown to exist in this game. It's part of what makes the salvage minigame so great, because you physically see them go over the desk to attack you. And this game has the best fucking ending of any FNaF game. It has more content than any other FNaF game. We were so close. The character designs other than Afton are great in this one. I like all of them. And hell, the office is nice and claustrophobic and cramped. It feels actually fairly well lit, and the dark ominous events work. The problem is our flashlight isn't real feeling. Like, if the characters are there in the vents, why can't we see them? Why are they just like 40 feet back where the light doesn't reach them or something? It becomes really weird to the player. It's something I just have complicated feelings about it, you know? And it's like they could have merged the design of the office and the whole actual tycoon section so well, like have limited power or make it so it costs money when you spend power so you can get bankrupt endings more frequently. Now you care about not wasting power personally because you run this place, and if this place spends too much power, you go bankrupt and lose the game. Imagine if you could buy like backup generators or like upgrades where you could like lock the doors for a little bit or something to spend this damn money on other than just making things faster. Like, the idea of having real money that has implications in the game is barely there, but not to the extent I feel like it could have been. A lot of complaint about previous FNaF games was how samey they could be, or how it was just one thing through the entire game. We could have ignored that almost entirely just by having the day sections be really dynamic with all the mini games you can play and all the things you can do, and have that affect the night sections personally to you as the player, because those funds affect your ability to survive. There's so much cool shit this game did do, and there's so much more cool shit it could have done. On the topic of the sound effects, there's a lot of comparisons you might be able to make to FNaF 4, and I think those are pretty well warranted, and it doesn't quite nail the Ennard boss fight sound mixing that I really liked of how it really played into the gameplay and where Ennard was. It's kind of like the rest of the game, very mixed for me. On one hand, I actually find it pretty damn clear when a threat is approaching me to attack. That feels very well choreographed. What I think bothers me though is it's really hard to tell when my threats went away. That does successfully scare me and catch me off guard a decent amount of times, which, you know, is good, it's a horror game, but sometimes it borders on the bullshitometer where I'm like, what the fuck, I thought I got rid of you, and it pisses me off. Overall though, I do find it's the game that scares me the most. I would say the jump scares in this game, while their visuals suck, the sound effect and the timing of them and when they appear does hit harder than almost any other jump scare does. I don't know why these are the ones that hit me so hard, but they do. It just would be better if the visuals worked and it wasn't just characters popping to frame. I think if there was a very clear sound effect that was just like, or like a scuttle scuttle, or like even just a character saying a voice line like, maybe next time, that would help choreograph what's going on in the game, which overall is a strange quirk of 6, which is, it's probably the most mysterious FNaF game that has been made thus far to the common player. There really isn't an official tutorial in the game of how to handle the threats or any of their specific rules. But then again, the characters are all kind of the same, so once you figure out what the game wants you to do with one of them, you can figure out how to deal with them even if you don't understand their movement patterns or like when sound effects play as much as you might in FNaF 1, for example. That said, it is kind of the FNaF 2 problem of like they're all kind of the same, but at the same time the gameplay loop is so starkly different than 2 that I'm not running into the problem 2 had. 2's problem was not, oh, there are too many characters that do the same thing per se. It was, because so many characters do the same thing, I have one gameplay loop every single time I do any action. Pull down the mask as soon as I'm done winding the music box, flip up the mask, flash Foxy, pull up the monitor, start winding the music box, rinse, repeat. But I'm not running into that cycle with 6 as much. So them all doing the same thing is less of an egregious problem and more just a disappointing factor. Like, oh, I kind of wish they all did something a little bit more unique. Though to step back to the actual video's title, the subject of FNaF 2 and 4 themselves, I feel like it really is a shame that these two could have been so much more than they were ever. Because those are the real examples of how execution matters so much more than the ideas or the actual characters. Because like, so many times when I see discussions about the scariest FNaF characters or the various FNaF games, it falls on things like the character design. But the thing is, character designs only go so far. Yes, when you're looking at brightly lit neutral renders of the characters, they might not be as scary. But to me, what makes a lot of the FNaF characters potentially scary or interesting or engaging threats and antagonists is how they're utilized in their game. What FNaF 2 and 4 fell short on was the failure to execute on the designs they had or the world they were trying to make. The nightmares don't feel like real horror monsters despite the slasher feel the game's going for, because they exist only in a few states to the player at a time. We can see glimpses of FNaF 4 showing its ability to do this angle and play with these characters in interesting, unique ways. But 3 of the threats, the ones that are there for the first 4 nights of the game straight, and hell, parts of the nights even after that, are so lame compared to what they could have been. And FNaF 2 completely killed its ability to make its main threats scary by focusing so much on one character it took away from everything else. I really don't want this video to become like an oh yeah sister location video, and that's not a shot to oh yeah, by the way. That's a shot to people who made that stance on sister location their personality when it regards the series as quality and a franchise. I really don't like when that happens, so actually think about what I'm saying and weight against it. Hell, if most people disagree, I'm fine with that. I think the peak click team game for this series has yet to be made, and a lot of fan games have gotten really close. I just would like to see it all put together. Just like with the Ben 10 video, where I ended it by saying like, hey, if anyone wants, I could make a video about what I think would be an interesting FNaF game. I'll toss that idea out into this video too, because I know people will probably watch this one much more than the Ben 10 video. Because I actually do have a lot of ideas of how you could make an interesting original FNaF game in the click team style. But who knows? Anyway, bye.